Certainty. It's one of the most elusive experiences in the world of personal finance, but it's also one of the most coveted. And it turns out that a lot of us, knowingly or not, are willing to pay a pretty steep price for it. Today, I'm going to be discussing the price of certainty when it comes to our personal finances, because it may well be more expensive than you think. And while that's a price that many of us would happily pay in certain circumstances, there may be other times where we'd be okay living with a little bit of uncertainty if we were made aware of the true costs of gaining those last few percentage points of sureness. But before we get going, be sure to like this video if you haven't already, as it really does help out the channel a lot, and subscribe with notifications on for more money-related videos like this one every single week. And if you want to further support this channel, you can check out some of the links I've left in the description below, which includes a link to the investing platform M1 Finance. Get started investing for free today. So before we get into the price of certainty, I feel it's important to ask one question first. How do we measure certainty in an ever-changing, often chaotic world? Well, the true answer is we can't. Not completely, at least. However, there are several ways that we can measure our confidence in a specific outcome. And when it comes to personal finances and forecasting in particular, being able to say that you're 99.9% confident that something will come to pass is about as close to true certainty as we'll ever get. So with that in mind, I'll be discussing a few of the most popular pseudo-certainty measurements in use today. They are certainty as measured by historical precedent, certainty as measured by model-based simulations, and certainty as measured by the unprecedented. Certainty as measured by historical precedent is exactly what it sounds like. You're looking back at historical data, say for things like the market returns and volatility for the investments you're planning on buying, and using that data to project forward into the future and see if your plan is likely to succeed. Reaching certainty based on historical precedent simply means that, given the assumptions that you used, there exists no historical precedent where your plan would have ultimately failed. So, for example, say John is a 30-year-old software engineer, and he's hoping to be able to retire at the age of 65. He saves around 50% of his income, and is thinking about putting his money into the stock market. For John to achieve historical certainty that he will meet his goal of retiring at the age of 65, he would need to know a couple of things. First, he would have to look at historical stock market data to determine what percentage of his nest egg he would be able to withdraw each year in retirement, since having that number, in conjunction with knowing how much he spends each month, would tell him how much money he actually needs to put away by the time he's 65. And second, he would need to know what the worst 35-year period to invest in the stock market was, because if he would be capable of reaching his savings goal in the allotted time based on the amount of money he's capable of putting away each month and the returns he would receive over that worst case scenario, he could confidently say that, as long as the next 35 years do not turn out to be worse than the worst 35-year period in recorded financial history, then John is virtually guaranteed to meet with success. Now, one of the first caveats that get mentioned by financial experts is that past performance is no guarantee of future returns, and that is absolutely true. However, this is still a popular way to get a general measure of our confidence in future projections because by definition, we don't know what the future holds until it's no longer a part of the future. And the fact is, we have to have something serve as the foundation of our projections or we'll never get the process started. Historical precedent is often used as that foundation, in large part because it's information that's readily available, and it's the only thing that encompasses all of the factors and variables of reality. Models can only be so comprehensive after all, as there's only so much computing power, not to mention coding time, available to us at any given moment. And there's only so much that we humans truly understand about how these highly complex systems actually work. Basically what I'm getting at is economics and markets are far from being solved sciences. If they were solved, then we'd be able to consistently predict market tops and bottoms with pretty much perfect accuracy. Another way we measure the confidence in our future projections is through models and simulations. Basically, instead of using strict historical scenarios to determine your projections for the future, you use historical data to create hundreds or even thousands of pseudo-randomly generated simulations and tweak your assumptions until you find a plan that achieves a 100% success rate in those simulations. For example, let's go back to John's situation. He's 30 years old, saving 50% of his income, which we'll say is $80,000 a year for this hypothetical, since he's a software engineer, and he wants to retire in 35 years. If we assume that inflation averages 3% a year over this time frame, which I know sounds really low at the time of this recording, but historically this has been right about what inflation has averaged in the US over the long run, despite occasional periods of high inflation like we're experiencing in 2022, then his annual spending would rise from his current $40,000 a year at the age of 30 to about $112,000 when he's 65. If John determined that he could withdraw an inflation-adjusted 4% from his nest egg each year, following the 4% rule, then he'd be hoping to build a nest egg of about $2.8 million by the time he's 65. Based Based on data from Yale economist and professor Robert Shiller, since 1871, the worst-case 35-year return to the S&P 500 was around 5.5% per year, which took place from 1883 to 1918. So, John would have achieved historical certainty that his current plan would meet with success, with over $1 million to spare in fact, given these assumptions. However, if we ran a simple simulation where John's annual investment returns were randomly selected from the annualized returns of the S&P 500 since 1871, we may reach a very different conclusion, simply because, through pure chance, some of those toughest years would have been selected right next to each other. In fact, here's a comparison of the average, minimum, and maximum 35-year rolling returns for the actual historical dataset and the simulation I ran where returns were randomly selected from that historical precedent. As you can see, there's quite a gap. Now, some would argue that this model-based approach provides you a greater level of certainty than simple historical scenarios do, since it accounts for the fact that we could someday see a new worst-case scenario play out. And as we just saw with John, that definitely can be true. However, we do run the risk of bumping into one of two problems when trying to implement this approach. The first potential problem is that we create models that are likely to project futures that are significantly more pessimistic than any outcome we're actually likely to experience in reality, largely due to building a simplistic model that doesn't take into account the factors and variables that are actually likely to influence our future financial experience, such as changes in the economy or our own lives and goals. This simplistic model for John that we just built definitely runs into this problem. Or we run into the potential problem of hubris, where we build a highly sophisticated model but may over or underweight the importance of some of the variables, or miss them altogether, leading to inaccurate projections. Take the downturn of 2020, for example. Back in 2018 or 2019, who would have thought that 2020 would have gone the way it did? Not many, to say the least. Now, that doesn't make this approach worthless, or even bad, it just means that it has its own drawbacks, just like using historical precedent as the foundation for our projections does. Remember, as tempting as it may be, especially when times are trying, pessimism does not necessarily have to correlate with future realism. A third way that we can measure the confidence of our future projections is through hypotheticals. What I mean by that is if we take the time to consider a variety of hypothetical, often catastrophic events that may not have a historic precedent in our own lives or locales, but we know are possible based on cases in other time periods or countries. For those of us in the US, one example of this could be hyperinflation. While we have had periods of elevated levels of inflation in the US, such as in the 1940s and 1970s to early 1980s, we have never experienced true hyperinflation since the advent of the US dollar. However, we know from other countries that hyperinflation is definitely something that can happen to an economy. So by thinking about what we might do should such a catastrophic event take place during our planning window, we can increase our confidence that our plans will eventually meet with success. Or at the very least make ourselves sleep better at night knowing that we at least have options should such a catastrophic event occur. So those are some common ways to measure the confidence of our projections. Now we can start to consider the costs of certainty based on that information. So what is the price of certainty? Well, that depends on how exactly you're measuring certainty, but let's take a look at an example to get a general idea. According to Robert Shiller's data, the S&P 500 has had a minimum 30-year safe withdrawal rate of about 3.68% since 1927. That means that, historically speaking, if you wanted to put all of your retirement savings into the stock market in the form of an S&P 500 index fund, in a worst-case scenario, you could withdraw a little under $37,000 a year, adjusted for inflation, for 30 years without outliving your savings. That's the point at which you reach historical certainty, at least with this dataset. However, as you can see from this chart detailing the minimum, average, and maximum 30-year safe withdrawal rates for this time period, the majority of rates are a fair bit higher than the minimum figure, meaning that in the vast majority of scenarios, you could have either withdrawn more to live on in retirement, or you wouldn't have needed to spend nearly as much time saving up for retirement as that minimum figure would suggest that you would. Here's a similar chart detailing each decile of the 30-year safe withdrawal rates. Basically, this chart tells us that, based on history, we could say with about 90% confidence that someone could sustainably withdraw an inflation-adjusted 4.27% of their nest egg each year for 30 years without running out of money using this approach. We could say 4.75% is possible with 80% confidence, and so on and so forth. These figures suggest that the price of that last 10% of certainty is approximately $150,000 in additional savings needed to reach financial independence, assuming a desired retirement budget of $40,000 a year, which may not take you that long to amass if you're saving a ton of money each month and the markets are rising, or it may take years if you're saving more modestly and or the markets happen to be struggling. You could also say that the cost is about $5,900 in foregone income each year in retirement based on a $1 million nest egg. If your budget or your nest egg were larger, the differences would also be larger, and vice versa. And as we saw before, using a simple model-based simulation may give you an even wider range of possibilities. If that's the case, then the price of certainty will grow even more, simply because the difference between your worst-case scenario and your more realistic scenario is going to be larger. Now, with that being said, is certainty worth the cost? Well, that really depends on the person, the situation, and how much additional certainty we're talking about here. For some people, and in some situations, the answer will be unequivocally yes. Sure, the price of certainty can be pretty steep in some cases, but the non-financial costs of uncertainty, i.e. the stress and potential for major lifestyle shakeups if things don't break your way when using an uncertain strategy, can be pretty steep too. And at the end of the day, there's more to life than money. But other times, the price of certainty may not be worth the rewards. For instance, is a 5% or 10% lower chance that you'd have to temporarily cut your spending budget during a market downturn, either by going without some things or simply by switching to cheaper alternatives that haven't inflated in cost as much, or potentially to re-enter the workforce or start a side gig for a short period of time, really worth the cost of admission? For some people, it would be. But for others, the fact that there's a roughly 90% chance that nothing will go wrong, at least enough to force a change, would make the cost of gaining that extra 10% of certainty no longer worth it. Again, it's all about priorities, perspectives, and balancing risk and reward in a way that works for you. Despite what it might seem, my goal with this video was not to give the impression that everyone should always be okay with sacrificing certainty in favor of living on the razor's edge with their finances, because that isn't always the ideal solution, and in fact, I tend to be pretty cautious with my finances personally. I just wanted to bring to the forefront of our attention a thought process that we all go through from time to time, even if only subconsciously, so that the next time we're faced with a decision that requires us to select a level of certainty that we're okay living with, we'll be able to make a more deliberate and conscious choice that's best for us and the situation. But that'll do it for me today. Once again, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to smash that like button if you haven't already, subscribe, and hit that bell next to my name so you'll be notified of all my future uploads. I generally upload every single Monday, and if you have a friend that would be interested in this kind of content, be sure to share it with them. Let's really get this information out there and start our own financial revolution.